Well, so I'm Gloria Jackson-Nefertiti, and I've been doing this Transcending Shame workshop actually since April 2017. And the very first time I presented it was at the very first ConvergeCon in Vancouver, BC. And so it was really, really a great privilege to be involved with something that was at the very beginning, when I was at the very beginning of presenting this work. Before I go to the next slide, if anybody is live tweeting, my Twitter handle is @GloriaJN, and you might want to use the hashtag SFBiCon. Okay, great. And what I'm doing in this section is I'm just starting out with slides of different people who I think have really profound things to say about shame, or people who are unapologetic about who they are. And on this slide, Lizzo says, "I made the decision that I just wanted to be happy with my body and happy with who I am. You have to find that love for yourself deep down inside, underneath all the questioning and ickiness." And toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to show another slide of Lizzo in the section that I call "People Who Society Thinks Should Be Ashamed, but Who Aren't." This is one of my favorite quotes by Anne Lamott. Oh, and let me also say that please feel free to take pictures of the slides, take pictures of me, and I have the green wristband, so feel free to just snap away. But I really like this quote. "I decided that the most subversive, revolutionary thing I could do was to show up for my life and not be ashamed." And Stella Young was a disability activist. She passed away a few years ago. This is another favorite quote. "To live unapologetically in a body you're consistently told you should be ashamed of is a political act." And the next slide, there is a quote that is similar. Jeffrey Marsh is someone who, I guess the best way to say it is that Jeffrey really spreads love and helps people to love themselves. And this picture of Jeffrey, now I wish that there was some way that I could show Jeffrey's whole body, because Jeffrey is wearing his high heels. And I have to say that Jeffrey does a much better job of rocking high heels than I do. Maybe I could be wrong, but but I really like this quote. "Being you without shame is a political act. Loving yourself is activism." And then I really like this quote from Ellen DeGeneres. "Whenever we hide everything from anybody, it's because we're afraid of what someone else is going to think of us. I had gotten to the point where it was more important for me to feel proud of who I was and live my truth than worry about what other people thought of me." Now, just as an aside, let me say that now my main job is modeling for art classes, but occasionally I will also work security for certain events in Seattle, which is where I live. And I had the opportunity to work security while Ellen was recording this Netflix special. So I thought that was really, really cool. And Sara Ramirez when she played the part of Callie Torres on Grey's Anatomy, her character said, "I'm bisexual, so what? It's called LGBTQ for a reason." There's a B in there, and it doesn't mean badass. Okay, it does, but it also means bi. And Sada came out as bisexual after her character did. On Twitter, there is this, it's Polyland, or Polydotland is the name of this particular user. And I don't remember what the thread was or what the topic was that they were discussing, but I just remember I saw this phrase that says, "It's much harder to shame you when you're not ashamed." And I contacted the moderator of Poly.land and said, "Is there any way that I can use this phrase in my Transcending Shame class?" And they said, sure, go ahead. Because I thought it was pretty amazing. And then there's a shame, or not a shame, there's a phrase about shame that I came up with. I think it was in October when I was preparing for one of the conferences. And this just popped into my head, and I thought, wow, that's really too good to ignore. I really need to use this. So the phrase that popped into my head was, "Admit the guilt, but don't give in to the shame." And later on, I'll be going over the difference between guilt and shame. I mean, I'm sure there are many differences, but there was one distinction that I heard years ago that just stuck with me. So, tell you a little bit about me. Now, somebody else made this graphic for me, and there was one thing that I wanted to add to it, but I wasn't able to because somebody else made it. I wanted to add autistic to this, but in the meantime, I'll just say I'm a poet, public speaker, singer, photographer, performance artist, artist model, and I mentioned that a little bit ago, breast cancer survivor, which I'll be getting back to in just a bit, bisexual, polyamorous, former fundamentalist Christian and cult member. Now I want to get back. I want to get back to the breast cancer survivor. That was basically how all of this started. In December 2013, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And believe it or not, the diagnosis ended up being a gift for me because it showed me just how short life is. And so when I realized how short life is, then I stopped caring what people thought of me, which was huge because, I mean, for the majority of my life, that was all I cared about, or the most of what I cared about is not only what people thought of me, but it was so important for people to like me. But the diagnosis, when it showed me how short life is, and I stopped caring what people thought of me, then that helped me to come out as bisexual, polyamorous, and sex positive. I mean, if I don't care what people think of me anymore, it's just so liberating for me. Oh, and I should mention too that I've been in remission for 6 years now. So I'm really thrilled about that. And not only that, but on Friday, actually before I got on the plane to come here, I had a mammogram. And, I was really, really hoping that everything would be okay, especially since I didn't want to come here and be distracted, by any, unpleasant diagnosis. Well, everything is still great. They said everything looks normal and we'll see you next year. So in this presentation, what I'm interested in doing is helping others to identify shame and recognize shaming behavior, and finally, to transcend shame. Now, before I go to the next slide, I mentioned earlier that I was going to mention the distinction between guilt and shame. And the best one that I ever heard came from somebody named John Bradshaw, who, when I lived in Portland, Oregon in the mid-1980s, John Bradshaw was somebody who would do these shame workshops. And I mean, the shame was just very, very important to him, as far as helping people to understand shame, how it worked in their lives. In fact, he wrote a book called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And it was a very, very important book. Yes, and but when I started doing research for this presentation, it just dawned on me that I hadn't heard anything about John Bradshaw in several years. So I was kind of curious about, what he was up to, what he was doing, what was going on in his life. And I found out that he passed away in 2016. So now I feel like by doing these workshops, I'm passing on his legacy, which feels really good. But as I mentioned, he had this distinction between guilt and shame that makes total sense to me. That really, really stuck with me. I've heard, other definitions, other distinctions between guilt and shame, which makes sense, but this one was just the easiest to remember. And to me, it made the most sense. So let's see. Now, Nelson Ellis, he was an actor on the HBO show True Blood, and he passed away in 2017. And now I definitely don't want to sound flippant or like I'm being uncaring or anything when I say that I really believe that shame had a hand in his death. It wasn't necessarily that shame killed him, but I really think shame had something to do with it. And in the next slide is a statement from his family, that just kind of reminded me that, maybe shame had something to do with his death. And the statement says, Nelson's father had bravely agreed for me to share the circumstances of Nelson's heart failure. Nelson had suffered with drug and alcohol abuse for years. After many stints in rehab, Nelson attempted to withdraw from alcohol abuse on his own. On the morning of Saturday, July 8th, and that was in 2017, after 4 days in Woodhull Hospital, Nelson was pronounced dead. Nelson was a gentle, generous, and kind soul. He was a father, a son, a grandson, a brother, a nephew, and a great friend to those that were lucky enough to know him. And this next sentence coming up, this is why I think shame had something to do with his death. Nelson was ashamed of his addiction and thus was reluctant to talk about it during his life. His family, however, believed that in death, he would want his life to serve as a cautionary tale in an attempt to help others. And I know that was kind of heavy, so, if everybody can just make sure to take a breath and to just come back. And this is probably a good time to say that if at any point during the presentation, if you feel triggered or you just feel that you need time out, there is really no problem with me if you need to leave the room for a bit. In fact, the most important thing as far as I'm concerned is taking care of yourself. So again, I just want to mention the phrase that I got from John Bradshaw, the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am a mistake. Now, I want to give you an example from my life that I think shows really well the difference between guilt and shame. When I was living in Portland in the 1980s, I lived in this apartment building that was not too far from Lloyd Center, which, if you're familiar with Portland, Oregon, you know where Lloyd Center is. There was one day, and this was after I had left the church and left fundamentalist Christianity. So, while I was a Christian, I was told so many times that I needed to wait until I was married before I had sex. Well, after I left the church, I was making up for lost time, let's put it that way. So there was this one time where I was having really wild, loud sex in my apartment. And I mean, that part was good, but the part that wasn't so good was that, I left the windows open, and it was like I didn't really care what the neighbors thought about that. But they didn't consent to that, So the next day, the landlady came to me, and she was just livid. And she said everybody could hear what was going on, and you were just carrying on, and now what would have been good and appropriate would have been just for me to feel the guilt, and to say something like, I am so sorry, that won't happen again, and actually that was what I did say. And that should have been enough, for me to just acknowledge the guilt and to say I was sorry. That should have been enough, but no, the landlady still felt the need to shame me. And she said to me, I thought you were a nice girl. And I said, I am a nice girl. But I mean, there was that slut shaming going on, and that somehow she felt that she needed to do that, even though I acknowledged my guilt and said I was sorry. That should have been enough, but apparently it wasn't enough for her. So. Okay, so what is shame? And I'm going to go through some excerpts from John Bradshaw's book, Healing the Shame That Binds You. Toxic shame, the shame that binds us, is experienced as the all-pervasive sense that I'm flawed and defective as a human being. Toxic shame is no longer an emotion that signals our limits. It is a state of being, a core identity. Toxic shame gives you a sense of worthlessness, a sense of failing and falling short as a human being. Toxic shame is a rupture of the self with the self. And he goes on to say, there is shame about shame. People will readily admit guilt, hurt, or fear before they will admit shame. Toxic shame is the feeling of being isolated and alone in a complete sense. A shame-based person is haunted by a sense of absence and emptiness. And so, what are some of the ways that you can recognize when you're being shamed? Well, someone will commonly use phrases such as, how could you do that? Or, you never, ... Or, you always, ... Or, you should know better. And a variation of this is, you know better than that. Now, I came from a really abusive family. There was a lot of domestic abuse, basically domestic violence that I grew up with. And my late father had this idea somehow. Well, now I'm the second oldest of 8 kids. And he had this idea that if you're one of the older kids, that there were certain things you were just supposed to automatically know, which makes absolutely no sense. But that was something that he thought. And so there were times where, if I didn't know something that, say, he thought I should know, and I have so many memories of him just cornering me and, shaking his finger at me and repeating himself over and over and saying, now you're older, you're supposed to know better. And of course that was very effective in making me feel shamed and just feel, worthless. Now, somebody else who really has a lot to say in the area of shame is Brene Brown. I really like this quote of hers. Shame needs 3 things to survive: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Empathy is the antidote to shame. The 2 most powerful words when we're in struggle: me too. And so I just want to take this time to read this paragraph from the handout that I gave you. Besides listing the 4 ways to transcend shame, it also lists some resources. And one of the resources is this article, Shame Excavation, Unearthing Toxic Shame. And there's this paragraph that I really like. The psychotherapist Joyce Martyr, I thought, just really, really hit the nail on the head with this, not necessarily a definition of shame, but definitely an explanation, and I think it's a really good one. Shame is self-sabotaging. It triggers feelings that we are unwell, unworthy, unlovable. Clients often identify with their shame and feel unworthy to welcome into their lives all the love and happiness that is inherently theirs simply for the asking. Now, there's another excerpt that I want to read, and I really apologize. There was this article that I saw online, I think through the Huffington Post. The name of the article is How to Be Friends with Another Woman by Roxane Gay. And I really wish that I remembered to leave the link on the handout, but I didn't. So if you just go to Google and just Google How to Be Friends with Another Woman by Roxane Gay, and it gives all these wonderful points. But there was one point that I want to bring up that I thought was not only funny, but very effective. Sometimes your friends will date people you cannot stand. You can either be honest about your feelings or you can lie. There are good reasons for both. So sometimes you will be the person dating someone your friends cannot stand. If your man or woman is a scrub, just own it. So you and your friends can talk about more interesting things. My go-to explanation is, I'm dating an asshole because I'm lazy. You're welcome to all. When I saw that, I thought that is just so refreshingly honest. She's not making any excuses about the person she's dating. She's just saying, yes, this is how it is. And I think that kind comes under the category of, well, earlier I mentioned that toward the end, I would have this category of people who society thinks should be ashamed, but who aren't. And now, there is somebody who I was in a relationship with for, nearly 20 years. It was a very, very dysfunctional relationship. There was a lot of shame, and, if I had more time, I would certainly go into more detail about it. But I remember, being treated so badly that after a while, I just stopped talking about him to my friends. I mean, when I first started dating him, already, people would say things like, wow, that doesn't really set well with me. That doesn't sound right, what he did or said, And I really wish that I could have been as refreshingly honest as Roxanne gave, to just state this is how it is. Actually, okay, here's what I wish I could have said. I wanted to say something like this. I'm in a relationship with somebody who treats me badly. And yeah, I know I should end the relationship. But to tell you the truth, I'm just not ready. Now, isn't that more honest than making excuses for your partner? Or, I just wish so badly that I could have said something like that. So in the next slide, here's another example of somebody who is completely honest and not ashamed. Okay, this is Erykah Badu, and at the time she had 3 baby daddies. I believe she has 4 now. and I really like what she said. Somebody was interviewing her and asked who her favorite rapper was. And she said, I don't have a favorite rapper. I have 3 baby daddy rappers. So I can't pick one or you're messing with my child support. I thought that was just so honest. There was no apologizing or no making excuses. I think that is such a great example. And I mentioned that I was going to have another slide with Lizzo on it. And I really, really like this. And no, I'm not a snack at all, baby. I'm the whole damn meal. She's so unapologetic. She doesn't apologize for her size, her weight, or anything. This is how I am. And I just love it. Oh, and let me say real quick. I mentioned earlier that I sometimes will work security for events. In Seattle, during Labor Day weekend, there's an event called Bumbershoot, which takes place the entire weekend, and it's just music and entertainment, and thank you. And last year, Lizzo was going to be one of the performers. And I remember thinking how wonderful that was, to be able to see her in concert and to get paid for it, Now, I wouldn't have actually seen her because I was behind the stage. Well, I not only didn't get to see her, I didn't get to hear her because she had some bronchial infection, and so she couldn't make it. So, as you can imagine, a lot of people were really, really disappointed. Now, normally when I do this presentation, it goes for an hour and a half, but since I don't have as much time, this is the group activity that I would normally do. I would have people get into groups of like 5 or 6 or whatever, and answer the question, what is it about you or your experiences that society thinks you should be ashamed of? What is it about you or your experiences that society thinks you should be ashamed of? So since we won't be getting into groups, because we don't have time, but if there's anybody who would like to answer that question, feel free to raise your hand. And I'll just say really quick for me, society definitely thinks I should be ashamed of being bisexual, and of being black. That's something that isn't my fault, couldn't be helped. But I was wondering if anybody had anything else that society thinks they should be ashamed of. Yes.
Being fat and still having sex with a lot of people.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Thank you. Yes.
Not conforming to a specific gender.
That's another good one. Yes. Oh my gosh. I'll have to talk to you afterwards. No. I didn't say that. Oh my gosh. Yes.
I would say using my male privilege.
That's a really good one. A really good one. Thank you. Okay, really quick. I'm going to go through the handout. I'm just going to go through the 4 ways to transcend shame. 1, love and forgive yourself. Toxic shame's greatest enemy is the statement, I love myself. To say, I love myself can become your most powerful tool in healing the shame that binds you. To truly love yourself will transform your life. And that quote, of course, came from the John Bradshaw's book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, by John Bradshaw. Rest in peace. 2, accept yourself unconditionally. This is something that takes time and practice. A good therapist can help facilitate self-acceptance, thus reducing shame. And I have a great therapist, and I feel really fortunate about that. 3, remember that shaming words and behaviors say more about the person doing the shaming than the one being shamed. You are not the cause. 4, avoid people who somehow can't recognize what you have going for you. Me, I finally resolved to never again enter a relationship with anyone who is unwilling or unable to see my awesomeness. It's only been recently that I've been able to actually say thank you, that I'm awesome. So if you'd like to stay in touch with me and like to stay connected with Transcending Shame, again, my name is Gloria Jackson-Nefertiti, and my email address is notgloriajean@gmail.com. And there's a story behind that, but I probably don't have time to get into it just yet. Or you can go to my website, notgloriajean.net. And that also shows where and when I'm going to be presenting next. It also has some links to some of the podcasts that I've been on. So I really wish I could open it up for questions, but we're out of time. But if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, that'd be great. And in the meantime, thank you so much for coming and letting me share with you.